Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our second of our 7 Lenten speaker series talks. This series is being offered by the Brandywine 100 Deanery. We hope that we will have many more joint projects with our 6 parishes within our deanery over the next 3 years. The Brandywine 100 Deanery is made up of St. Joseph and the Brandywine, Immaculate Heart of Mary, St. Helena's, the Church of the Holy Child, Holy Rosary, and St. Mary Magdalene parishes. Our deanery leadership team, made up of lay people and led by me, has been working for the past year on a strategic plan for the deanery. I'm Father Michael Carrier, the pastor of the Church of the Holy Child. I'd like to, as we begin this evening, just introduce you to each of the members of our deanery leadership team that are present with us this evening. Don Brezzolera, who is from the Church of the Holy Child. Dick Kirk from St. Helena's. Beth Smith from St. Mary Magdalene, Rita McDowell from Immaculate Heart of Mary, Michael Graney from Holy Rosary, Tom Van Buskirk from St. Joe's and the Brandywine, and Kylie LaValle from St. Mary Magdalene. More information on our deanery pastoral planning will be coming out sometime after Easter, after it's finalized, which we are currently working on. Each speaker for our series has agreed to speak for 40 to 45 minutes, and then to allow 15 to 20 minutes for questions. All the questions will be held until the end of the session. If you have questions, I invite you to send them to brandywinedeanery@gmail.com, and that is capital B, RANDYWINE, capital D, EANERY@gmail.com. I'm excited this evening to introduce to you our distinguished speaker, Dr. Stephen Barr. He is from within our diocese. Stephen is the president of the Society of Catholic Scientists and professor emeritus of theoretical particle physics at the University of Delaware. He received his Ph.D. in physics from Princeton University in 1978. His research was centered mainly on the grand unified theories and the cosmology of the early universe. In 2011, he was elected to be a fellow of the American Physical Society for his original contributions to grand unification, CP violation, and baryogenesis. These are scientific words that I've never heard. He writes and lectures extensively on the relation of science and religion, and he's authored a couple of books, Modern Physics and Ancient Faith, and The Believing Scientist, Essays on Science and Religion. He was elected in 2010 to the Academy of Catholic Theology and was awarded the Benemerenti Medal by Pope Benedict XVI that same year. This evening, we're very grateful to Dr. Barr for speaking to us in our speaker series. And as a reminder, if you have any questions during Dr. Barr's talk, please email them to us at brandywinedeanery.org. Dr. Barr, welcome.
Well, thank you for having me, Father. Before I begin, I just, wave your hand if you can hear me okay. Okay, good. I wasn't sure my sound system is working. Originally, I was going to give this with slides, but due to technical difficulties, I'm going to give it without slides. But the slides are not important, really, so it shouldn't make any difference. As Father said, I'm the president of something called the Society of Catholic Scientists. We started back in the summer of 2016. I and 5 colleagues, scientists who are Catholic. And we've grown to over 2,000 members around the world, mostly in the US, but actually in over 60 countries, I think we have members. So we're continuing to grow and thrive. And I strongly encourage you to go to the website of the Society of Catholic Scientists. If you just Google Catholic and Scientists, you'll find it. And there's a lot of good educational material on there. So I'll mention that later in the talk. So my talk is called Science and Religion, the Myth of Conflict. And as you probably know, many people think that there is some kind of a conflict between science and religion. In fact, surveys have shown that that's one of the leading reasons given by people who leave the faith, who lose their faith, that they believe there's some kind of conflict. Now, whenever people find out that I'm a scientist and a religious believer, I'm sometimes asked whether I find any difficulty in reconciling those two things. And I've always found that a strange question, and so do other Catholic scientists I know who are asked that. Because some of the same things that make me rather, a Catholic Christian, made me a scientist. They have some of the same roots, a sense of wonder about the world and its beauty and magnificence, a passionate desire to know the reason behind things, a deep conviction that everything holds together in some coherent way. So for me, both the Catholic faith and empirical science are ways of making sense of the world. Science tells us about the things that we can see and measure, but our faith has a much wider scope and answers deeper questions. Questions about the ultimate cause of the world's existence and order, the purpose of human life and our ultimate destiny. It tells us about spiritual realities, about God and man, love and truth, good and evil, sin and redemption, things that empirical science cannot tell us about. The Catholic faith and empirical science are indeed two different ways, two different perspectives on reality, but they are not conflicting ways of looking at reality. I've been a scientist for 46 years and a Catholic for 70 years, and I know of no scientific fact or well-established scientific theory that contradicts any authoritative teaching of the Catholic Church. So why do so many people seem to think there is some kind of a conflict between science and religion? Well, one reason is that some people lump all religion together. And so that every example of superstitious beliefs or magical thinking they come across is evidence to them of the irrationality of all religion. Many also have misconceptions about what science has told us about the world, or they have misconceptions about what various religions teach, and specifically what the Catholic Church teaches about things. Even many Catholics don't really or have misconceptions on some issues when it comes to what the Church teaches. But another reason is that many people fail to make a distinction between a certain philosophy called scientific materialism and science itself. Now, what is scientific materialism? Materialism is the philosophical view that all reality is reducible to matter and its behavior. The only ultimate reality is matter. Scientific materialists are people who think that modern science somehow implies that materialism is true. The discoveries of science somehow show that materialism is true. Now, materialism is an opinion that is held by many scientists, no doubt, and by many people who claim to speak in the name of science, but it is not a part of science. It has no claim to being science. It is, as I said, a philosophical viewpoint, a philosophical opinion. Now, if matter were the only reality, then, of course, God would not exist because he's not a material being, nor would human spiritual souls, nor many of the things that our faith talks about would exist because many of them are not material entities. A human being would be, if materialism were true, would be nothing more than a complex arrangement of atoms, a complex structure made of atoms, and everything about a human being, including our thoughts and so on, would be ultimately explicable in terms of how those atoms move and the laws of physics that govern them. In other words, scientific materialism not only implies that God does not exist, but it implies that, strictly speaking, you don't exist either, not as you thought you did. For example, the popular astronomer and science writer Carl Sagan once put it this way in one of his books. He said, quote, "I am a collection of water, calcium, and organic molecules called Carl Sagan," unquote. Francis Crick, the co-discoverer of the structure of DNA, wrote in one of his books that your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. Now, the reason I'm talking about materialism is that many atheists today are atheists because they're materialists. Because they're materialists, they feel that God, the soul, all of those things cannot possibly exist. Now, for some of its adherents, scientific materialism is more than just a philosophy. It's a passionately held ideology that sees science as having a saving mission. And that mission is to free the human mind from superstition in all of its forms. And they regard religion, to free the human mind from irrationality in all its forms and superstition. And they regard religion as a form of irrationality. So for those people, it's not enough that science is something good and brings us greater understanding of the world in which we live. There must be an enemy to be vanquished, and they cast religion in that role. They see themselves as taking part in a grand struggle between reason, typified by science, and its enemies, typified by religion. And that explains why some scientific materialists, like Richard Dawkins, are very zealous in their attacks on religion. Now, such people have a well-developed critique of religion, which has at least three aspects: a philosophical, a historical, and a scientific. Their philosophical claim is that there is an inherent contradiction between the scientific and religious outlooks. Science, apart from anything science has discovered, the way science understands the world and the way religion understands the world are totally antithetical to each other. For science is based on reason and evidence, and they say religion is irrational because it is based on dogma, faith, and mystery, which involve belief in things that cannot be seen and for which supposedly there's no evidence. Science is based on natural explanations and natural laws, whilst religion is based on the supernatural. They see religion as being a matter of myth and magic, and therefore the very antithesis of a rational scientific outlook. Their historical claim is that religious believers and institutions have been hostile to science historically and have tried to suppress it. This is powerfully symbolized in their eyes by the Catholic Church's treatment of Galileo 400 years ago. And this impression of a science-religion warfare over the centuries is reinforced in the public mind by the never-ending battles against evolution waged by fundamentalist Christians. The materialist scientific claim, or the scientific atheist scientific claim, is that the actual discoveries of modern science over the last 400 years have debunked or undermined basic Christian beliefs about the universe and humanity's place in it. As the story is often told, Science has dealt one blow after another to the religious picture of the world. Copernicus showed that the human race is not at the center of the universe. Newtonian physics showed that nature has no purposes or goals, but is governed by blind and impersonal forces. It's purely mechanical. Modern astronomy showed how small and insignificant we appear to be in comparison to this vast cosmos. Darwin, some say, showed that human life is an accident, a fluke, and that human beings differ only in degree and not in any radical way from lower animals. Advances in neuroscience and artificial intelligence are thought to be demonstrating that the supposed soul is nothing but the working of the brain, a complex biochemical computer. And the list could go on. Now, in this talk, I'm going to focus primarily on the atheists' philosophical and historical claims that religion and Christianity in particular are inherently contrary to science and historically have been its enemies. In the last part, if time allows, I will discuss some of the things that modern physics has discovered and argue that they're actually more consistent with the traditional Christian view of the world than with atheism and materialism. Okay, so let's start with philosophy, then I'm going to move to some history and then hopefully some science at the end. So let's begin with the supposed opposition between the supernaturalism of religion and the naturalism of science. Now, Christianity and Judaism were never based on supernaturalism, if you mean by that a denial or a rejection of the idea that there is a natural world, a natural order. In fact, scholars tell us that the book of Genesis was in part an attack on the supernaturalism and superstition of ancient pagan religion. When Genesis, for example, said that the sun and moon were lamps placed by God, or lights placed by God in the heavens, to light the day and the night, it was attacking the paganism in which the sun and moon were worshipped as gods. And when Genesis said that man is made in the image of God and is to exercise dominion over created things, Genesis was, among other things, attacking the paganism in which human beings worshipped created things and bowed down to them. We're not to bow down to these, worship the created things, but actually have dominion over them. In paganism, the world was filled with occult forces and myriad deities, gods and goddesses of oceans and forests, of wind and rain and lightning and fire and sex and fertility and so on and so forth. But Jews and Christians taught, on the contrary, there's only one God, and he's not part of the universe. He's not to be found within nature, within its phenomena and forces, but he is beyond nature. He is beyond nature and is beyond space and time and matter. And in fact, he is the author of nature, the author of the universe. In this way, biblical religion stripped the physical universe of divinity and made it into a natural world, no longer the abode of gods, but the creation of the one God. And since God, the author of the world, is wise, the world and intelligent, the world he made must reflect this. It must therefore have been made according to principles and laws that can be discovered and understood by reason, because God is himself reason. And since God is good, The natural world was seen as something good and therefore worth studying. So biblical religion taught that there is a natural order which comes from God. And what characterizes this natural order, this natural world, and reflects the rationality of its creator is precisely that it is orderly, lawful, harmonious, and beautiful. So consider this passage from the letter of Saint Clement to the church in Corinth, written around 97 A.D. Saint Clement is the fourth pope, the third successor of Saint Peter as the Bishop of Rome. So in this rather long letter, I'm going to take a small excerpt. He wrote to the Corinthians, he said, "The heavens, as they revolve beneath his government, God's government, do so in quiet submission to him. The day and the night run the course he has laid down for them. The sun, moon, and starry choirs roll on in harmony at his command, none swerving from its appointed orbit. Laws of the same kind sustain the fathomless deeps of the abyss and the untold regions of the netherworld. The impassable ocean and all the worlds that lie beyond it are themselves ruled by like ordinances of the Lord. Upon all of these, the great architect and Lord of the universe has enjoined peace and harmony." Or consider this passage from the Latin Christian apologist Minucius Felix, writing around 200 AD. He said, this was in a book directed to his pagan contemporaries, explaining why they should believe in a creator God. He said, "If upon entering some home, you saw that everything there was well tended, neat, and decorative, you would believe that some master was in charge of it and that he was himself much superior to those good things. So too, in the home of this world, when you see providence, order, and law in the heavens and on earth, believe that there is a Lord and author of the universe more beautiful than the stars themselves and the various parts of the whole world." So look at what these two passages, I could give many more. In fact, I give a talk where I give many more. Look at these early Christian writings said. They don't point as evidence of God, they don't point to supernatural phenomena, and they don't point to miraculous departures from the order of nature. They point to the order of nature itself and its lawfulness. The ancient argument was that if there's a law, there must be a lawgiver. God was the lawgiver not only to the to the Israelites, and not only to the human race, but to the cosmos itself. So God says in the book of Jeremiah, quote, "When I have no covenant with day and night and have given no laws to heaven and earth, then too will I reject the descendants of Jacob and of my servant David." Psalm 148 tells of God establishing the sun, the moon, the stars, and the heavens by a decree or law. So the idea of God as a rational lawgiver to the cosmos helped give birth to the idea that there are laws of nature. The idea of laws of physics specifically, that there are these mathematical laws, comes from Descartes and Newton in the 17th century. It has Christian roots. Descartes was a Catholic, Newton was a Protestant. And both of them, they're the ones who proposed really the idea of universal mathematical laws of the universe. Both of them saw these laws as having been imposed on matter by the divine lawgiver. So when atheists say we can explain everything, we don't need religion, we can explain everything from the laws of physics, which is what many atheists say. Ask them, why are there laws? Why are there laws of physics? Where did they come from? Well, the idea of laws came from Christians who said they came from God, the lawgiver. But atheists don't have an answer for why there are laws or where they came from. Now, the fact that Christianite belief actually historically helped give rise to the idea of laws of physics, laws of nature, is admitted even by some atheists. So, for example, the famous Harvard biologist Edward O. Wilson, who died a few years ago, in one of his books, had this passage. He was explaining why Chinese civilization, for all of its great achievements, including scientific achievements, did not come up with the idea of universal laws of nature. And he said this: Chinese scholars had abandoned the idea of a supreme being with personal and creative properties. No rational author of nature existed for them. Consequently, the objects they meticulously described did not follow universal principles. In the absence of a compelling need for the notion of general laws, thoughts in the mind of God, so to speak, little or no search was made for them. Now, I quote him because he was an atheist, and yet he admits that the idea of laws of nature really has Christian roots. Now, our faith does, of course, tell us that there are supernatural realities and that they have effects in the world. But the word supernatural, which is a technical term in Catholic theology, supernatural means above the natural. So the very concept of the supernatural would make no sense unless there were a natural order to begin with. And the concept of miracles, which are extraordinary events that go beyond what is naturally possible, presupposes that there is a natural order that determines what is naturally possible and what isn't. There's no logical contradiction there between the idea of miracles and the idea of a lawful universe. For the same lawgiver, the same divine lawgiver who established the laws of nature, can also suspend or override them. Because he makes the rules, he can make exceptions to them for the sake of some greater purpose. And as we'll see, the men who led the development of modern science in its first several centuries, people such as Isaac Newton, were almost all devout Christians who in fact believed in miracles. Now, there's a lot of confusion today, even among religious people, about how nature relates to God. Instead of seeing God as the author of nature, they see God and nature as somehow opposed or in competition with each other. So that if something has a natural explanation, then God has nothing to do with it. And if God is the cause of something, well, then it's supernatural. It's a zero-sum game. So that many people therefore look for evidence of God only in what is outside the course of nature or inexplicable by natural explanations, inexplicable by science. That is, in the gaps of our scientific understanding. Hence the expression, the God of the gaps. And atheists think that by closing those gaps in our scientific understanding of the world, they'll leave no place for God to hide. But the traditional Catholic view, traditional Christian view, is utterly different. If God is the creator of the natural world and established its laws and gave things their natural powers, then God's existence is evident in nature itself and its ordinary processes, not just in the supernatural or in miracles, but nature itself as the handiwork of God testifies to its creator. This is the message of the following passage from the Old Testament Book of Wisdom, a Jewish work of around 50 BC. And I love this passage. He's talking about the scientists and philosophers of ancient Greece and castigating them for not finding God, finding the creator of the world. So he says, for all people who were ignorant of God were foolish by nature, and they were unable from the good things that are seen to know the one who exists, nor did they recognize the artisan while paying heed to his works. But they supposed that either fire or wind or the swift air or the circle of the stars or the turbulent water or the lights in the heavens were the gods that rule the world. If through delight in the beauty of these things, people assumed them to be gods, let them know how much better than these is their Lord, for the author of beauty created them. And if people were amazed at their power and working, let them perceive from them how much more powerful is the one who formed them. For from the greatness and beauty of created things comes a corresponding perception of their creator. So created things, nature testifies to its creator. Notice that the evidence of God, of a creator, to which this scriptural passage points, consists of phenomena and processes that are perfectly natural. Fire, wind, swift air, the circle of the stars, turbulent water, the lights in the heavens, and so on. So again, it's not a zero-sum game between God and nature, because nature itself is God's handiwork and testifies to its existence, his existence. Medieval theologians distinguish two ways that God acts in the world. God can act directly in a supernatural manner, for example, turning water into wine, or he can accomplish his will through the operation of natural causes and natural processes, which in the terminology of theology are called secondary causes. God is the primary cause, but natural causes are secondary causes. It has always been the Christian view that God ordinarily acts through secondary causes, through nature, through the natural. In the words of the great scholastic theologian, Francisco Suarez, about 400 years ago, he said, God does not interfere directly with the natural order where secondary causes suffice to produce the intended effect. Now, this principle, which goes back, as I said, the Middle Ages and actually the Church Fathers, was important for the founding of science, for it implied that when we're confronted by some puzzling event or new phenomenon, we should look first for natural causes, natural explanation. That's the default. Now, superstitious people tend to see the supernatural in every unusual or strange event. But this was criticized by the great medieval scientist and theologian, Nicholas Eerdmans, who was a bishop also. Eerdmans said that in explaining the marvels of nature, quote, there's no reason to take recourse to the heavens or to demons or to our glorious God, as if he would produce these effects directly, any more than he directly produces those effects whose natural causes we believe are well known to us. So he said, look first for natural explanation. Another great medieval scientist and philosopher, Jean Buridan, wrote, the philosophers, by which he meant scientists, the philosophers explain such marvels by appropriate natural causes. The common folk, not knowing of causes, believe these phenomena are produced by a miracle of God, which is usually not true. Okay. And this has been the Catholic Church's attitude always. So, for example, before declaring some in canonization process, before declaring some miracle as being worthy of belief, if the church investigates and first tries to exclude the likelihood of a natural explanation. So the default is natural explanation. Now, this brings us back to a very crucial theological distinction, which I think the failure to grasp this distinction, I think, is at the heart of a lot of the idea that religion and science are at odds. And that you have to choose between God as an explanation and science or natural explanations, that it's, as I said, a zero-sum game. And that's the idea, the distinction between what I already referred to before, primary causality and secondary causality. God, the primary cause, and natural causes as a secondary cause. And there's a very important distinction between these two. And I think I can explain it best with a simple analogy. And the analogy is to the author of a novel or a play. So God is the author of the universe, and in some ways analogous to, say, the novelist as the author of a novel. Now, let's take an example. Consider the Hobbit, J.R.R. Tolkien's novel, The Hobbit, and also Lord of the Rings. So in The Hobbit, there's a dragon named Smaug, and the dragon is killed by a fellow named Bard the Bowman. And Bard the Bowman shoots an arrow and kills the dragon. So if I were to ask you, what is the cause of the dragon's death? What caused it? Was it Bard the Bowman shooting an arrow? Or did the dragon die because Tolkien wrote the book that way? Now, you see, that's an absurd question. I mean, it's absurd to have to choose between those two, because the answer is both of them are correct explanations, and they're not competing explanations. At the level of the plot of the novel, within the plot of the novel, the cause of the dragon's death is Bard the Bowman shooting an arrow and the arrow hitting the dragon. That's the cause within the plot. But Tolkien is the cause of the novel, of the whole novel, and its whole plot, and of everything that happens in the novel. So the analogy is that you might say Tolkien is the primary cause of everything that happens in the novel. Bard the Bowman is a secondary cause. He's a cause within the plot. Tolkien's the cause of the plot. They don't compete. And in the same way, natural causes, God is the cause of everything that happens in the universe. Whereas within the plot of the universe, one thing causes another. So if I were to ask, and this is why the church has never had a problem with the idea of the evolution of species. If you were to ask, why does this creature, this thing exist, this giraffe, or why do crocodiles exist, or whatever? Is it because they are the product of a long sequence of secondary causes, of natural causes within the plot of the universe? Or do they exist because God wrote the plot of the universe that way? And the answer is both. And the church has always understood this. So this also makes clear why this analogy, why materialists are wrong to think that we believe without evidence. We believe in God with no evidence. What they're looking for is the kind of evidence that we can have through our senses or through scientific instruments. But our senses and scientific instruments tell us about parts of the universe. They can tell us about causes within the universe. They can tell us about magnetic fields and gravitational fields and electricity and other things. But God is not a part of the universe, just as Tolkien is not a part of The Hobbit or part of Lord of the Rings. God is outside, beyond the universe. So somebody wandering around in just as somebody wandering around in Middle Earth is not going to bump into Tolkien, going to see Tolkien and say, hey, Tolkien, thanks for having created us and having created Middle Earth. We wandering around in this world are not going to bump into God. We're not going to lay eyes on him. He's not a part of the universe. Yet, just as the existence of the novel testifies to the existence of a novelist, even if he's not in the novel, so the existence of the world testifies to its author, even though he's not a part of the world. And so we do have evidence. We do have evidence, but not the kind the materialist wants. So God is a cause, the ultimate cause. It's just that he's not a cause within nature, he's a cause of nature. And so that's where I'm going to leave the philosophical part of my talk, my response to the atheist philosophical critique. Let's talk about some history. I'm running out of time. I may not get to the physics, which may not disappoint everybody, but it'll disappoint me. So let's turn to the materialist and the atheist historical critique. They have the idea, many people, actually, this is a very widespread idea, that throughout the history of modern science, modern science began really in the 16th century and exploded in the 17th century, which is really the century of the scientific revolution, the 1600s. And a lot of people think that ever since that time, there's been this warfare between the worlds of science and the world of religion. This is called by historians of science the conflict thesis or the warfare thesis. And it's held to be true by almost everybody. And until fairly recently, even by many historians of science. But actually, it is now completely debunked. Historians of science today unanimously reject this idea that there has been a historical warfare of science and faith as a myth. And they trace this myth in large part back to some anti-religious propaganda of the late 19th century, but I won't go into that story. But there's a simple way to see that there wasn't a big war going on for the last 400 years between the worlds of science and religion. And the simple way to see that is that almost all the great scientists who founded modern science, and for a period of at least 2 centuries, were themselves religious. So you can see that. If I had a slide, I would display their names. I display the names of the 20 greatest scientists of the late 16th century and 17th century, the founders of modern science. It's a who's who. Every single one of them was a devout Christian. Let's take some of the top names of the scientific revolution. Johannes Kepler, famous for discovering his 3 laws of planetary motion, was a devout Lutheran who announced the discovery of one of his laws with these words: "I thank you, Lord God, our Creator, that you have allowed me to see the beauty in your work of creation." Galileo, despite his troubles with church authorities, remained a practicing and believing Catholic throughout his life. Descartes, one of the great mathematicians of all time and very important in the history of science, believed, he invented coordinates, for example. Descartes believed in God and that human beings possess immortal spiritual souls, and proclaimed himself an Orthodox Catholic. Blaise Pascal was not only a mathematician and physicist of genius, but a Catholic whose life had been powerfully transformed by a mystical experience, and who wrote eloquently in defense of Christian belief against radical skepticism. Robert Boyle, considered the founder of chemistry and the first modern chemist, was a pious Anglican who said that the best day, the most appropriate time to do scientific experiments was Sunday, because they are a form of worship. Isaac Newton, the greatest of them, spent as much time on theological and scriptural studies as he did on mathematics and physics. And this was true well beyond the 1600s. For example, the 2 greatest physicists of the 1800s were generally considered to be James Clerk Maxwell and Michael Faraday. And they were both deeply devout Protestants. So I'm going to not go into great detail on the history of science, except to say that a very important role was played by the church as an institution in inventing universities. Universities were invented in the Middle Ages. And by the end of the Middle Ages, there were about 100 universities in existence throughout Europe. And it was in these universities, which were Catholic institutions to begin with, that the science was studied for the first time in a systematic, continuous fashion from generation to generation. As the late famous historian of science, Edward Grant, put it, it was in the medieval universities that the study of science was, for the first time in history, institutionalized. And that was very important in the development of science. Now, a little known fact that dramatically illustrates the positive role the Catholic Church has played in the development of science is the large number of Catholic priests who made major discoveries. I'm not just talking about priests who were scientists, but priests who made major scientific discoveries, and including founding entire branches of science. So I'm going to mention only a few of the most outstanding. So one is Niels Stenson, more commonly known as Nicholas Steno, who was ordained by birth. He was raised as a Lutheran. He eventually converted to Catholicism. He lived in the 1600s. And he was famous in three branches of science. And I'm told by people who studied anatomy in medical school that they learn about Stenson's duct and Stenson's vein and so on. There are various parts of the body that are named after him. He was the greatest anatomist of his day. And he was also, in a way, the founder of the science of geology. That was his greatest achievement. He developed the correct theory of sedimentary rock and the origin of fossils, which unlocked the history of the Earth. And he is regarded as one of the principal founders, and you might say the founder of the science of geology. He eventually became a priest and eventually was made a bishop, and was actually declared Blessed Nicholas Steno by Pope John Paul II. Second example is a French priest, a friar of the Mennonite order named Marin Mersenne. Now, he is considered the founder, along with Galileo, of the science of acoustics, the science of sound. He's the first person, for example, to measure the speed of sound. He also made important contributions to the theory and design of reflecting telescopes, and his religious house became a meeting place of famous scientists. His voluminous the way scientists learned of each other's work back in those days, again, the 1600s, was through correspondence. And he was the center of the web of correspondence among scientists. So he was called by the Dictionary of Scientific Biography one of the architects of the European scientific community. He is also in a recent book, History of Science, called The Center of the World of Science in the 1600s. Another priest scientist of importance was Christoph Scheiner, a Jesuit astronomer, who was one of the co-discoverers of sunspots. There were about 4 or 5 people who discovered sunspots with telescopes around almost simultaneously. One was Galileo, and one was this Jesuit astronomer, Scheiner. Another Jesuit astronomer, Riccioli, again in the 1600s, is famous for a number of things. First of all, he made an extensive star catalog, which became a standard reference work in those days. He developed methods for measuring time precisely in experiments. He was the first person to measure the acceleration of gravity accurately on the surface of the Earth. And turns out, it was recently discovered that Riccioli discovered a very important effect called the Coriolis effect, 2 centuries before Coriolis did. An even more important Jesuit scientist of the 1600s was Francesco Grimaldi. He discovered a phenomenon in physics is called diffraction. And diffraction is something that shows that light is made up of waves. And now it turns out, since we know from quantum mechanics that everything is made up of waves, diffraction is a central, very important phenomenon in all branches of physics. So whether you're taking a course in college in freshman physics or studying physics in graduate school, there are going to be entire chapters of your textbook on diffraction, discovered by this Jesuit scientist of the 1600s. The founder of the science, or considered the founder of the science of hydraulics, was a Benedictine priest, Benedetto Castelli, who was a friend and pupil of Galileo. And Castelli had himself two important students who were famous in the history of science. One was a fellow named Torricelli, who invented the barometer. Another of Castelli's students was named Bonaventura Cavalieri, who was himself a priest, and he actually made very important contributions to the founding of calculus. In fact, Leibniz and Newton are given credit for independently discovering calculus, and Leibniz paid tribute to Cavalieri and said that Leibniz, had built on the work of Cavalieri. So this priest was helped to found the calculus. Probably the greatest biologist of the 18th century, now moving to the 18th century, was Lazzaro Spallanzani. And he had many contributions to biology that are too numerous to mention. The founder of the science of crystallography was René Just Owy, a French priest who lived at around the time of the French Revolution. In the 19th century, Father Giuseppe Piazzi of the Theatine order made many contributions to astronomy, including discovering Ceres, Ceres, which he called a planet. So he discovered a planet. Later, it was reclassified as an asteroid, but more recently, it isn't really an asteroid. It really is a planet. And recently, the International Astronomical Union reclassified it again as a planet. So one of the planets, Ceres, it's on the same. It's now considered a dwarf planet on a par with Pluto. So Piazzi, this Italian priest, discovered a planet. One of the founders of astrophysics, in fact, you might call him the founder of astrophysics, was a Jesuit priest in the early 1800s named Angelo, or mid 1800s, named Angelo Secchi. And he developed, I'll just say he's one of the founders of astrophysics. One of the greatest mathematicians of the 19th century was a Czech priest named Bernard Bolzano, and he helped put modern mathematics on a rigorous foundation. He did a very important work making mathematics more rigorous. The founder of the science of genetics was an Austrian priest, the Austrian monk Gregor Mendel. So everybody has heard of him. And the last one I'm going to mention is less well known than Mendel, but deserves to be just as well known. And that's the founder of the Big Bang Theory. The central pillar of our understanding of the beginning of the universe and its development, which is the Big Bang Theory of cosmology, was proposed by a theoretical physicist named Georges Lemaitre, who was also a Catholic priest. So I think every Catholic should know the names of three of these people I mentioned. Lemaitre, Lemaitre, Georges Lemaitre, the founder of the Big Bang Theory, Mendel, the founder of genetics, and Steno, the founder of geology. And just knowing that will help dispel this myth that science and religion have been at war. In fact, Professor Lawrence Principe of Johns Hopkins University, one of the world's leading authorities on the history of early modern science, has written, quote, "The Catholic Church has been probably the largest single and longest term patron of science in history." So in spite of the Galileo case, which was a bad bump on an otherwise, was a blot on the history, the church's history, but it was really the exception to the rule. The church actually, on the whole, has a glorious record when it comes to science. And something that we should talk more about, people should become more aware of, we should tell the world about. So I finished with my talk, I'm afraid, and I didn't get to the physics. But what I'll say is this. The theme of the last part of my talk is also the theme of my book, Modern Physics and Ancient Faith, which is that many of the discoveries of the 20th century, many of the discoveries before the 20th century, several big discoveries, seemed to many people to be at odds with the religious picture of the world. But it turns out that some of the things people thought they knew about the universe in the 19th century turned out to be false. And in the 20th century, there were several major breakthroughs, which actually brought the scientific picture of the world much closer to the religious conception of the universe than to an atheist or a materialist one. And if I had another 25 or 30 minutes, I would go through some of those big discoveries of 20th century physics that have actually brought our view of nature rather close in several important respects to the religious view. But I'm going to have to pass on that. I don't know if I left any time for questions. So Ellen and Father, I open it up.
If you haven't submitted a question or you'd like to, again, I remind you, it's brandywinedeanery@gmail.com. Brandywine Deanery, all one word with capital B and a capital D for that. There was a question about the recording. Since we are recording it, it will be available to all the parishes within our deanery to put on their websites. So you'll be able to access the recording of this evening's presentation as well. All right, we have one question so far. Alongside the atheist, many Catholics seem to view science as existing in opposition of Catholicism because many scientific discoveries seem to reduce the barriers of sinfulness, for example, birth control. Could you comment on that?
Reduce the barriers. I don't. First of all, science does not. Repeat the question, just so I don't answer the wrong thing.
Alongside the atheist.
I understand it. So that's because science discovered these means of contraception. It's made it easier to sin. Well, you know, science also discovered atomic bombs, which make it very easy to kill. And science has discovered science is one thing, and the uses to which it's put are something else. And human beings are able to turn anything to evil. I mean, it's part of original sin, is that things which are not in themselves bad can be used for bad purposes. And anything that humans discover which can be used for good, we will find ways to use them for evil as well. So you can't blame science for that. I don't know if that's why some Catholics think science is contrary to faith. I've never come across that view before. It may be true of some people, but I've never heard that before.
That's the only question we have.
Okay. Well, let me then close. Well, maybe that's good because I didn't leave any time for questions. But I'll say the following. So I went through a list of great scientists or important scientists, great scientists and other scientists who are priests. But if you go to the website of the Society of Catholic Scientists, and you can go type in Catholic Scientists, plural, CatholicScientists.org, you'll find a lot of educational stuff on our website. One of them is a set of about 100, soon to be 100, little mini bios, about 300 or 400 words each, typically, of important Catholic scientists of the past. It's a carefully curated set of biographies. If you go to the internet, you'll find many lists of Catholic scientists. They're very unreliable. But this is carefully curated. And these virtually every scientist in this list was a believing and practicing Catholic. And they made important discoveries. And in fact, any scientist going through that list will be blown away. I was blown away. I knew about half of these people, but in the course of working on this, I learned about the other half. It is really kind of astonishing how many of the great scientists of the past were believing and practicing Catholics. Another resource, which is very useful, is something we call Common Questions About Science and Faith. And there we have 16 questions that teachers in Catholic high school told us are the most common ones they get from their students about science and faith, with, we think, very good clear, straightforward answers to these 16 questions. So there's a lot of good stuff on our website, which I encourage people to go to.
My apologies, but where do you submit questions on this app? I don't see it very
You
handy.
have to go to brandywinedeanery@gmail.com.
I see.
Just
There's no chat on this. I apologize.
For technical reasons, there wasn't. But since you're speaking, why don't you say what your question is?
Oh no, I don't have any question. I was just
Okay.
wondering how you submit them for future reference for these. That's all. But excellent presentation. Thank you.
Thanks. I wish I had time to go into the physics, which is, after all, my field.
Thank you, Steve, for a fantastic presentation this evening.
Oh, thank
you. Thank you to everyone who participated. I'm also grateful for those who helped behind the scenes with some of the technical pieces of it. I remind you that next Wednesday, February 28th, Leah Labrisco Sargent will be our speaker. Miss Sargent, will speak about how to build community in our churches now. Steve spoke about atheist. She was an atheist, a convert to Catholicism. So she's set to do a wonderful presentation for us. So that will be next week at the same time. So I invite you to invite friends or family members that you might know that might benefit from our series. And the more we get it out, the more that we could have participate in our program. So again, thank you for your participation. Thank you, Steve, for a wonderful presentation. And God bless you and have a wonderful evening.
Father, there's one more question.
Oh, okay. Go ahead.
Great talk, Dr. Barr. Probably not enough time to address this, but scientifically speaking, how do we reconcile that Adam and Eve had 3 sons but populated the entire earth?
Aha. Okay, now that I don't have time to talk about that except very, very briefly, but that's of the 16 common questions about science and faith, several of them, at least 1 or 2, are about Adam and Eve. So if you go to the website, the Society of Catholic Scientists, we do address that. And actually, there's at least one article. We have about 40 articles on our website so far. At least one of them is on the whole question about Adam and Eve. So first of all, so by Adam and Eve, we mean the first truly human beings, the ones with spiritual souls. Now, the traditional view is that there were 2 original human beings with spiritual souls, who Scripture calls Adam and Eve. One possibility is that there was a larger population. In fact, modern genetics tells us, and I'm not a geneticist, but this is apparently well established, that that the human race or Homo sapiens never had fewer than several thousand people, okay, individuals. There was a time, presumably about 200,000 or 300,000 years ago, when modern humans appeared, and probably from what's called an ancestral population of several thousand. That is, several thousand individuals who were interbreeding, with each other. Now, God could have taken just 2 of them and conferred on them a spiritual soul, and they would have been Adam and Eve. But that doesn't mean that they're the only biological humans around at that time. That is, if you think of human as biologically human, then there had to be thousands. But if you think about theological humans, beings who have immortal spiritual soul, there could well have been 2 of those thousands who had a spiritual soul. There's always been the question for 2,000 years, who did the children of Adam and Eve marry? Right? Either the children of Adam and Eve married other children of Adam and Eve, which would be incest, or they married non-humans, which would have been bestiality. And that's always been a question. Where did they find spouses? And if you look in Genesis, it's a little strange because they go out, Cain goes out and finds people living there, and he, gets married. Where did those people come from? Well, actually, in a way, science alleviates the problem because it shows us that there had to be thousands and thousands of Homo sapiens, anatomically modern humans, as the scientists would say. But it could well have been that only two were ensouled by God, raised to the level of rationality and freedom, and they would be Adam and Eve. It's also possible that God gave souls to all of them, so that Adam and Eve stands for a whole population of thousands. Anyway, that's all I can say now, but you can read about that on our website.
Well, this concludes our Lenten speaker series for this evening, and we wish you all a good evening. Thank you.
Thank you.